Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to lecture here, and I'm really sorry that I could not come in person to give a lecture. I would really very much like to ask everybody, if you have a question, please ask me right away. Don't wait to the end of the lecture, because I cannot see your faces, so it's very hard to give a talk without having any feedback whatsoever. So if you have anything is unclear, or you have some complaint, or you have some correction to make, or observation, please don't be shy. So just either the best is just start talking. I guess I will hear this, or you can also write a message and I will be checking my chat from time to time. Okay, so I will give 2 lectures today. So the first will be about working memory. Both are about memory, because that's something that I'm working on these days, and I find it a very fascinating subject for research. And in particular, what I find very interesting is that it allowed me to learn things that normally neuroscientists don't know, because for some unfortunate reason there is a very big disconnect between psychology and neuroscience. This was already mentioned here at the lecture by Konstantin Anokhin, that neuroscientists study brain without paying too much attention to cognition. That's how I think he put it. And in particular, they don't know much about the research in psychology, and this is reciprocal. Also, psychologists don't know much about the brain. So I'm trying to put some connections between these 2 fields. And working memory is a very good example, because where I think you can make connections, and that's a good example how this can be very fruitful. Because working memory is something that was the whole idea was proposed or invented by psychologists, but neuroscientists took it up, so they know something about it also. So what is working memory? Normally, if I say memory, I guess most of the people, what they will think about is things like, let's say, how we remember what happened to us in the past, let's say some trip that we took years ago, or maybe our classmates in school, or maybe some knowledge that we learned long time ago. So for example, I can ask you what time War and Peace was published, or who is the author of Romeo and Juliet. So you will give me an answer because at some point in the past you learned this. So this is what most people, I think, will say if you ask them about memory. So this is a very explicit process. I have a normally it comes with some question or a cue, and people will make some effort depending on how easy this information can be achieved, and then they will explicitly formulate the answer. So this is a long-term memory, because this can be memories that go back to very, very long time. However, this is not obviously not the only type of memory that there is, and there are other types which are no less important, maybe even more important for our cognitive abilities, but they are less explicit, and I'm not sure you can say they are subconscious, but we're not really aware about them. We are not really aware that we are always engaged in these types of memory. And I can give you some examples so that you understand better what I mean. So for example, think about you listening to me speaking. So obviously you understand, if you know English in this case, you understand what I'm talking about. So how does it work? So like naively, it sounds as if you are just processing the speech, that you are kind of absorbing the pieces of speech that are meaningful and extract the meaning. But of course, if you think about it a little bit, you may absorb instantaneously, let's say, a single word, but the word doesn't convey any meaning about what I'm going to tell you. So in order to understand the meaning of a sentence, you have to integrate several words at least, and they are not presented simultaneously. They're presented with some delay that can be slow or can be fast, depending on how I'm talking. So you need to keep this information in some form in order then to, at the end of the sentence, to make sense of it. And then this is how it continues. So you obviously have to have some memory that is working all the time when you're listening to speech, when you're perceiving speech. Okay, but that's not only speech. So let's say when you observe a certain object, let's say you look at the face, again, it may look to you that you are just having a snapshot of a face and immediately process it, but this is not how it really works, because we are moving our eyes all the time. There's this sharp saccades that happen with a speed of about 3 per second. So this means that every second we have several snapshots that are not the same. We don't even know about this. We don't know that we have these different images that we perceive with our eyes. So to us, it looks like we are just observing the face. But behind the scenes, there is this consecutive information that is has to be somehow integrated. There is a reason that we are moving our eyes, because every time we move the eye, we are perceiving some different aspects of the visual object, and so we have to integrate it to perceive this, to get this feeling of perception. And there are other examples that you can think of. So this means that basically for all the time that we are engaged in some kind of cognitive processes, I think we are employing our working memory. Okay, so this is I think I gave you enough intuition so that you can now know what I'm talking about. So this is the scheme that we can come up with. So you have a, I hope you are seeing my my pointer. Can somebody tell me if you see my pointer?
Yes, it's fine.
Okay. So let's say you have a sensory input that there is always some very brief sensory memory that's sometimes called iconic memory, because this is always the case, because all the sensory areas have some kind of time constants inherent to them. So the information has to remain for a very brief time in the same way as it appears. But then there is a process of selecting some of this input into this working memory. So you could think about it, you know, in psychological terms, it's like a certain buffer that that selects some information that comes to you. Not everything you are aware of, right? Most of the information that comes to our sensors, we are completely unaware of, because we are paying attention to this. And then this information may or may not also be transferred to long-term memory, and this process, this transferring information is reciprocal. We can also extract information from long-term memory into working memory. This is what happens basically when I ask you a certain question to ask about, let's say, something that you remember from long time ago, and then when you recall this information, this becomes explicit and is transferred to the working. Okay, so the mysterious thing is that this selection process is has a very limited capacity, right? We cannot simultaneously keep track of many pieces of information, right? This is a very well-known effect from our everyday life. We cannot do many things at once, right? That's the reason, because our working memory has a very limited capacity. But I would say it's really a completely mysterious thing. So we don't know, nobody really knows why this is, what's the purpose of this, why working memory is has such a limited capacity, and of course we don't really know the mechanism. Okay, so in this talk I will try to present some theoretical ideas about how working memory works, why this how this can account for this observation about capacity, and have some mathematical models of these ideas. Let me first again stay at the psychology level and motivate better this observation of capacity, right? I say that we know that working memory has a limited capacity, but you can of course be more precise. So this is some cartoon, another cartoon way of working memory. So you have, let's say, a lot of information that is presented or extracted from long-term memory, and then there is a very limited buffer where some of this can be brought to, and this is what we can pay attention to. So it's another term, it's a focus of attention. This, again, the term that psychologists use. So let me show you some of the experiments that were done. Some of them are quite elegant and made a big impression on the field. So this is an experiment by Sperling. All of this is quite old, as you see, but some of these experiments are really very influential. It would be good for us to know about them. So these experiments consisted of presenting these arrays of symbols, so either letters or digits sometimes, of different size and different configuration. From a very small one like this, so only 3 letters, to this array where you have 12 elements. And the arrays were briefly presented to a subject, and then he was asked to report what he remembers, what was shown to him. So you can do it either without providing any additional cues. So you just flash this array, let's say, and then ask a person to write down, let's say, the elements that he can still do. Or you can provide a cue. So you can, let's say, at some moment, which can be simultaneously with this flash or just right after the flash, you could provide this cue. So in this case, it was just an arrow that points to a middle row, and then ask the person only to report the elements in the row. So let's think of what would we expect. So you would expect, in the case where there are no cues, you would expect that that you cannot really report all the elements that are presented if they are exceeding the working memory capacity, right? Because you will not be able to pay attention to all of them. So you will only report, let's say, some number of them. And this will be some kind of an estimate for the working memory capacity. However, if you have a queue, and then if you somehow manage to selectively pay attention to the elements in the right row, then you will be able to report the whole row, right? So you will know exactly what were the elements in this row, and this is more or less what was reported, right? So now I'm saying you that this is what you expect, but by the time the experiments were done, this was had a very strong impression on people. So this is an old graph, so I'll just tell you how the results were presented. So if you look at so the full report means that you are asked about the whole screen, about no cues are reported, and you plot how many letters or digits are correctly reported, and on the x-axis is how many letters are in stimulus, and you see that if you increase the array, you cannot report more than a certain number of digits. Okay, so this is a very clear manifestation of this working memory capacity, and you see that the number of elements that you can correctly report cannot exceed roughly 4 or 5. So it's a very, very small number. So that's basically the main result. So these other curves relate to the experiment where you have a queue where you actually recall, you can report the queued row very well. So if you recalculate it, so naively you would say that if you can report all of the digits in this row, this would appear as if you really have information about all of this. So this is of course not the case, but this is just the way the data was presented. But the main result for us here is this lower curve that says that it saturates very quickly. Okay, so I hope this is clear. So what's going on here is that it looks like you providing a queue, you could selectively mark the items of interest and put them into the focus of attention, to the working memory. If you don't have a queue, then you just have a random choice of images that you can put into the working memory, but no more. But in no way you can exceed the capacity of this working. So in this picture, we don't really know how things work. We just have this idea that there is a certain limit. And there are many more experiments of this type. So I can just point you, if some of you are interested in knowing more about the psychological aspect of this phenomena. For me, it was very interesting to read this review about the magical number 4 in short-term memory. Let me, I think for the purpose of interest of time, I will not present you any more evidence to this. And let's just move to more towards the neuroscience. So what as neuroscientists, let's say, now that we got ourselves familiarized with this phenomenon and observations, what would be the issues that we want to now address from the neuroscientific perspective? And I think the major challenge, which is, I think, completely open, is to really understand this capacity limit, right? So why as I said, the question of why, theological a reason, why would the evolution develop in such a way that we are so severely limited in our working memory capacity, and also how this emerges from the brain processes that underlie working memory. And of course, we need to say something about, we need to agree about what are the brain mechanisms that underlie working memory. Then we can ask questions, so how multiple items can be maintained in working memory, and what determines the capacity. So what are the most accepted ideas? This is in theoretical neuroscience. If you think about working memory, basically you're thinking about Opel model. So let me give you some very brief review of Opel model, and I'm really hoping that you at least heard some aspects of this. But this is a very influential theory of memory that was developed in the 80s, and especially among physicists was very popular because led many people from physics to contribute somehow to studies of neuroscience. So how Opel model thinks about memory. So what happens when you remember something, and what happens when you recall something in terms of this theory. So Uh, so there are several key ideas here. So first idea is that every memory item is represented by a certain activity pattern in some network. So think about a big neural network that is dedicated to memory processes, and different memory items are encoded in this network by different activity patterns. So in the simplest case, you can just say different neurons are encoding, different groups of neurons are encoding different memory patterns. So how is this encoding embedded in the network? So how does network know about different encodings? This happens by long-term synaptic modification. So connections between the neurons change in a certain way, such that these particular configurations of activity become attractors. So attractors means become stable activity states of the network that can persist for a certain time without being driven from outside. Okay, so again, in a simple situation, you can think about a certain memory item encoded by a group of neurons, and if you make connections between these neurons strong and strong excitatory connections, then these neurons can excite each other and maintain the activity even when the external input that drives this activity already ends. So this means that the network can have information that is embedded in it in terms of synaptic strengths. And then when you extract information into, so let's say you recall a certain memory item, you are just cue the network, you initiate it in the vicinity of this attractor, and then the network just converges to corresponding state. So I'll show you some cartoon about how this can work. So this is mathematical description of this work. This is a modification of the Opel model that I introduced with my PhD advisor at Landau Institute back in 1988. So you have a network of neurons. Every neuron is described by a binary variable 0, 1. It's active or not active. You have connections that, between the neurons, this matrix Gij. You have a dynamics. So every time step, the neuron integrates the inputs that it receives from other neurons. So this is this summation here of synaptic strengths multiplied by the activity. It's compared to the threshold, and if the total synaptic input is above threshold, then the neuron becomes active, and if it's below threshold, this becomes inactive. So this is the step function. You have memory patterns, which are just random sparse binary vectors of 0, 1s with the fraction of ones being some parameter, small parameter f, which is the sparse representation. You assume that these memory patterns are random, so they are uncorrelated, chosen by chance. Then there is a process of storage of this information, so embedding these memory patterns in the network, where every time you want, you start from no connections, so tabula rasa. You add, every time you want to put a new memory into the network, you change the connections according to this rule. So every time you increase connections between neurons that encode the same memory, and you reduce the connection between neurons that encode different memories. That's how this rule works. And then at the end, you have this information embedded. And then it can be read out by providing a certain initial state. So this is some simple illustration of this idea. So I have a network where a certain number of memory states are embedded. And the activity of each neuron is shown here by this color. So white means active neuron and black means inactive neuron. So you have some configuration, initial configuration of this network, which is completely random. But there are a certain number of patterns that are embedded due to a particular synaptic rule. So if you let the network run its dynamics according to the these equations, update equations that I showed you, then you will observe that in few steps of iteration, the network converged to this state, which was one of the memory states that was embedded in it. Okay, so you can think about this as now this particular state is in the working memory regime, because you can now explicitly attend to this. Before, at this moment, when before the network converged to the state, this memory was not in the working memory regime because it was hidden. It was stored in synaptic connections, but was not expressed in terms of the activities of the neurons. Okay, so in this framework, basically having a working memory equals having a certain pattern being reactivated. Okay. And dynamically, this is always on of multi-stability in recurrent networks, but for now, I think we can keep this. So this idea became very popular, and there was some experimental support for this. So I will show you some of the most famous papers that was written about it, that provided experimental support for this idea. So this was a recording. So people were training monkeys to perform a memory task. That the memory task was delayed memory task. The paradigm was like that. So the monkey, the experimenters generated this set of images that were initially completely new to the monkey. And then the monkey was experiencing these images for a very long time. So the training took several months. So the monkey became very familiar with these images. And the task that the monkey was performing is that there was every time one image was presented to the computer screen, then there was a certain delay, and then there was another image. And the monkey had to indicate whether the second image matched the first one or not. And to do the task, the monkey had to remember what image was presented first, and then keep this memory for the duration of the delay. Delay was varied, but eventually was brought to quite long. So it was several seconds of the delay. So this is the protocol, the first presentation, the delay, and the second presentation. So what were the results? So they were, after the monkey learned the task and did it with a certain degree of accuracy, they inserted electrodes in the higher visual areas, and they found very interesting neurons that exhibited the following properties. So many neurons in this area respond to the images in a selective way. So every neuron would respond, let's say, to some images, but not to the others. So they developed this selectivity. But there were also some neurons that not only responded to the image, but they also persisted in being active throughout the duration of the delay. Okay, so here we have a, and this was also selective. So there was a certain number of neurons for every image, or you can say vice versa, for every neuron that they recorded from, there were only a small fraction of the images for which the neuron exhibited this delay activity. So you can think about it as being reactivation of the attractor. So this activity would be represent the activity of a certain attractor. So this neuron is just one neuron out of a group of neurons that constitute this attractor. And then you can think that this is how the monkey remembers which image was presented. And this was a very sparse encoding. So again, for every neuron, there was only a small fraction of images that exhibited this, that could drive this persistent activity. Right? So this is a histogram over the images, and there were only few images that could drive this persistent activity, which was significantly higher than spontaneous activity of the neuron. Okay, so this was taken as a very strong evidence in favor of this attractor hypothesis and this persistent activity hypothesis. Let me now point out, so in this framework, it's actually not so easy to think about why would the capacity be so limited. So if these representations are distinct, then it's not clear really why can't you just reactivate several of them, and what would make, why would a special magic number emerge here? So this is one issue with this picture. I'm now going, I'm going to motivate and present you an alternative hypothesis, but I want first to tell you what issues with this picture people encountered when they were developing these ideas. So the main, actually the theoretical issue was that these experimental recorded activities are very low. So you can even see it here, even though this is obviously one of the best neurons that they could come up with, that this persistent activity is very low compared to the maximal firing rate that the neuron can exhibit. You see that this was always below 10 hertz. So on average, roughly just a little bit above 5 hertz. So this is a low activity, and the problem with low activity, first of all, it's very difficult to think about this as being a robust mechanism, because any perturbation would then eliminate this. And also theoretically, it was very difficult to develop neural network models that would generate this robust low level activity. Okay, so these are some of the other observations that people published. You see that you can observe the delay activity in this neuron, but this is really very, very low compared to the activity during the response to the stimulus itself, which can be very robust and brisk. The delay activity typically is very low. And moreover, people also observed the situations where the activity was not even persistent. So these are other observations where not only the delay activity was very low, but this looked like it completely disappeared sometime during delay and then would come back sometimes. So there was some dynamic processes about this. And in the framework of attractor network, the moment the persistent activity disappeared, there is no more information in the network that would tell you which stimulus was actually reactivated, right? Because the information was only kept at the level of the firing rates. So this people were struggling with these issues, and so this motivated me and my students and colleagues to come up with an alternative idea. And the motivation for this idea was having a closer look at the way synapses work in the brain. So the Opel model is based on this very sharp dichotomy between synaptic forms of memory and activity forms of memory. Right? So synapses keep information for the long term, and the firing rate or neural activity keeps information for the short term. And there is nothing in between. But this ignores the whole field in synaptic physiology that is very well known and extremely well studied, which is the short-term synaptic plasticity. So it is well known in neuroscience, but was less well known for theorists, that synapses are much more complicated dynamical devices than just transmitting spikes from one neuron to another with a certain amplitude. And this is illustrated in this experimental recording. So this is from the paper of Markram and Wang and Markram, who are synaptic physiologists studying the synaptic transmission in the brain. So what you see here is the response, synaptic responses in the cortical neurons to a pulse of action potentials of spikes in the presynaptic neuron. So these are brain slices in the prefrontal cortex of a mice. So they stimulate a presynaptic neuron with so that it emitted high frequency pulse of high frequency set of train of spikes, and then there was a pause, and then there was another spike, and then they recorded the response in the postsynaptic neuron. And you see that there is a very rich picture here where there were different types of synapses. So at least it was very rare that the synapse would have a more or less constant strength, right? You see, even this synapse that kind of looked more or less stable here exhibited some strengthening after you wait for some time. So this gap was half a second, this experiment. And other synapses exhibited ongoing change in their strength. So this could be either fast weakening, so this is called synaptic depression, or a fast strengthening, which is called synaptic facilitation. And moreover, this facilitation did not disappear immediately. So if you look at this, neither depression or facilitation didn't disappear immediately. You see, in this case, the synapse was depressing, and then after a gap of half a second, this was partially recovered, but not yet back to its original strength. So these processes take certain time to be raised. And here it's even more dramatic. You have facilitation, and this didn't decay at all at the time constant of at the time window of half a second. Okay, so this means that the synapses undergo this short-term changes all the time that they're activated, and so it seems quite natural to think that these processes can also be used in the brain to keep information for brief periods of time. So this is exactly the time scales that are relevant for the working memory, as we said, because working memory is the memory that is involved in processing on the time scale of single seconds. So basically, let's say if we focus on this particular synaptic type, this means that if you have a certain burst of activity in the neuron, the synapse, even if this activity terminates for a certain time, the synapse is still carrying the information about this event, right? So even if you probe the synapse sometime later, it will be in a different state than before this event. So there is some information in the synapse for these brief periods of time that does not require the neuron to fire all the time. You don't need this persistent activity for this information to persist, right? Without this processes, the moment the activity would stop, the information would completely disappear. But if we have synapses like this type, the information does not disappear for a certain time. You need to wait for a longer time before the information really disappears. So we propose then that this mechanism can also be used for as a mechanism for short-term or working memory. So this process can be very easily modeled mathematically. So this is kind of a minimal phenomenological model that I came up with when I worked with Markram at the Weizmann Institute. So we developed this scheme based on some biophysics of these processes, where At every synapse, you have two kinetic processes. One that is responsible for depression, which is here shown in red color, and another process which is responsible for facilitation. So depression is mediated by the release of the neurotransmitter. So you have a certain limited amount of neurotransmitter in the synapse. So, and every time you use the synapse, so every time the presynaptic neuron spikes, a certain fraction of the neurotransmitter is released. So this fraction is denoted by this variable u from used. So this fraction of neurotransmitter is used. And then it cannot be immediately recovered back. So there is a certain process of replacement, which is described by this first term in this kinetic equation that has a characteristic time constant tau d, which stands for depression. So this is one process. And this variable u here, which describes how strong the depression is by itself a kinetic parameter in the model. And this is described by the second equation, which is facilitation. So facilitation is biophysically mediated by influx of calcium into the presynaptic terminal. So every time there is a spike in the presynaptic neuron, there is a certain calcium channel that opens up and increases the release probability in the site. So this dynamic variable u that stands for the instantaneous value of release probability is increased by this calcium influx. So every time there is a spike, there is an upregulation of u, and then this u determines how much of the neurotransmitter will be released. So these are, you can think about this as competing processes. And depending on the parameters of these two processes and the most important parameters of this time constants of synaptic facilitation and depression, you can describe all of this richness of synaptic processes that you record in the brain. So you can, by manipulating these parameters, you can reproduce all of this classification in the cortex. So let me show you this particular example where you choose a certain level set of parameters. You simulate a presynaptic spike train. You solve this kinetic equation. So you have two traces here, red and blue for x and u. So you see x goes down during the spikes and then recovers partially between the spikes, and blue goes up and then slowly declines back. So in this case, time constant for facilitation was chosen to be longer than the depression. So overall, the synapse had some degree of facilitation and depression. So there was this mixed situation. And then after the delay of half a second, the neuron was actually more facilitated than during the activity. So this is how these processes can be captured mathematically. And now you can implement this. This is an example again of this simulations of this mathematical model. So now you can see how Opel model can be extended to this process. So again, let's imagine that you have a network which has different memories embedded into it. So I show this neurons that are encoding each memory by, let me see. Okay, so there are no more questions. Please ask me questions, because otherwise, I don't know if I'm going too slow or too fast. So maybe I already lost you. Yeah. Any questions at this moment? Okay, so now the crucial thing is whether you can implement this mechanism in the network of the Opel type. So imagine that you have a network which stores some number of memories. And now you want to evoke one of them into the working memory stage, into working memory regime. So you want to reactivate one of the memories by providing a cue. So this would be, let's say, asking a question or showing a certain image, something like this. So let's say you provide a cue that reactivates some number of neurons that are encoding a certain memory. And we want to see if the network can keep the information in terms of the synaptic facilitations. And of course, you can make this idea work. So this is the simulations of this network of integrated fire neurons. So I show you here the spikes of the neurons in these colored dots. So I show here, not to clutter the picture too much, I show you only two populations here, shown in green and black. So this is the state of the network before any cue was presented. So here, neurons are just firing spontaneously with a low rate. And there is nothing here is reactivated. So this is a response to a cue. So during this time epoch, we provide a strong input, strong but very brief input to neurons from the black population. And as a result, they respond to this stimulation for a very brief time. And then this external excitation is withdrawn, and the network is in the regime where the activity immediately goes back to more or less the same level as it was before the stimulation, right? So you see that in terms of the spiking, at least by eye, you cannot see any difference. So there is no information or very little information in the spiking activity here about which stimulus or if any stimulus was in fact presented here. However, if you look at the synaptic state of the neurons between of the synapses that connect the neurons of the black population, you see that there was a very important change. So these two lines show the average level of these two variables, X and U, for the synapses between black neurons, right? Because nothing whatsoever happens for the green neurons. They were not really affected by the stimulations. So their synapses did not undergo any modification. But these synapses undergo very significant modification. You see the red trace went down by about a half, and blue trace went up also by about a factor of 2. So this means that by the end of this epoch where the neurons are active, the synapse is in a very different state from before, right? Both of the X and U variables have a very different value. And this means that overall, this synapse is facilitated because the product of these two variables is stronger, is bigger than the product before. This means that for a certain period of time, the information about the stimulus is hidden in the synaptic form. And it can be recovered by providing, in this case, in order to recover this information, you can just provide a non-specific weak excitation to all the neurons in the network. So this would be like a readout signal. It's not specific now, so we provided here. We provided to all of the neurons in the network. You just give some. You can think about it as some kind of attentional pulse. So you increase your level of attention, and then the neurons from the black population pop out. Right? They emit a very brief reactivation pulse here. And green neurons do not emit this pulse. So this way you can reactivate the attractor, but not in a persistent way. There's no persistent activity. So let's say in terms of metabolic processes, this is a much more efficient scheme because you don't need to keep this firing rate all the time that you need the information in memory. You only reactivate them at the moment where you need the information. Okay, so these are some summary of the regimes that you can get in this network. So this is the regime where there is no persistent activity and you need to present the readout signal at the end of the delay period. This is another regime which is activated by just increasing the whole level of excitation in the network a little bit. And in this regime, the network reactivates the pattern by itself. So from time to time, it enters into this periodic regime of activity where every period of time there is an automatic reactivation of a certain population, and every time this population reactivates, this prevents from synapses to decay to their spontaneous state. So the information will be can in theory be maintained here forever, as long as these reactivations are not are maintained. If the information is no more needed, then you can reduce this level of excitation in the network, and then this reactivation stop, and eventually the synapse will decay back into the spontaneous state. Or if you have a even stronger level of excitation, the network can also go into the persistent regime. So you have this richer set of possibilities here if you have this short-term synaptic facilitation. So this is the idea, an alternative way the information can be stored about the working memory can be stored in the network. And you can put several items in the working memory. So these are two examples. So let's focus on this example. What happens if you have two items? So let's say you hear one word, and then it enters into working memory regime where these neurons are reactivated periodically. Then you hear another word, and then the network goes into the regime where both of these populations are reactivated sequentially. So you can say that this is the regime where both of the words from a sentence are now in the working memory. And then you can continue doing it until you let's say you understand the meaning of a sentence, and then you can turn your attention to the next sentence.
Sorry.
Yes.
Is there some interaction between this process between two words? The process of reactivation.
Sorry, can you repeat? I don't hear you well, so if you can just speak up a little bit. Yeah.
Sorry for interruption. Is there some interaction between the process of reactivations?
There is an. What is the question? So you are saying there is a interactions.
Completely independent process of
they are not independent. Yes, I will now go and look at this in more detail. They are obviously not independent because these neurons are part of the same network. And this is, for example, you can ask why these reactivations happen out of phase. This is precisely because there is a common pool of inhibitory neurons in the network that prevent these reactivations to collide on each other, right? So these are clearly not independent processes. And this is now precisely my next question that I want to address. So if this, this is basically, in some sense, this is another type of attractor in the network. So if you know the terminology of dynamical systems, attractors do not necessarily mean equilibrium state or the fixed point. Attractors can be also dynamic. So in this case, the network enters into the periodic attractor or limit cycle, where these two populations are activated sequentially and all other populations are not reactivated. But this is one attractor. So this is a coherent state of the whole network, which determines the timing of this reactivation. That's why these reactivations happen in a certain time. So now you can ask, why do you have a capacity? Why couldn't you just add why couldn't you then reactivate another pattern and another pattern? Why couldn't you have as many states as you can? And if you cannot, what determines the number, the maximal number? Okay, so this is the question that we addressed in this model. So let me just summarize the architecture of the network. So we simplified, because to simulate this networks of integrated fire neurons, it's a quite extensive exercise, and also there are many parameters that you have to adapt in order for the network to work in a certain way. So it's hard to get a really understanding of what's going on. So we simplified the network to model to make it tractable analytically, and then we simulated, went back to the integrated fire network. So I want to, in the remaining part of my presentation, I want to show you the mathematical analysis of this network that was exactly now addressing the question of why you have a capacity and what parameters in the network really determine this capacity. So this is the architecture of our network. You have this populations of neurons that are encoding different memories. You have a inhibitory population that is reciprocally connected to all of these populations, and you have recurrent connections within each population that are basically encoding the information about each stimulus. And for simplicity, here we neglect the overlap between this representation, so we basically can look at each population as being one unit, and there are no crosstalk, so we also neglect the connections between different populations. So this is kind of a minimal mathematical model that, as you will see, behaves more or less in the similar way as the full model, but we can address more precisely the question of capacity. So these are the equations that we have. I don't want you really to go very into each term, because I know it's very difficult to see equations on the screen, but just for you so that you understand how these equations were derived. So you have a set of neuronal populations which are labeled by this index mu, and each population is now one unit. So for each population now described by one variable, which is more or less its total activity or its total synaptic input that neurons in this population receive. So this is denoted by H. And this is the equation for each synaptic input. You have a synaptic time constant, which is typically in the order of a few milliseconds. There is a passive decay, so if there is no input, then the synaptic input decays to zero. This is the recurrent self-excitation that is characterized by strength of recurrent connections J. And there are these new variables U and X that describe short-term plasticity. There is a common inhibitory activity Ri. There is an external background input, so this just determines the general level of excitation in the network. As I showed you, that's an important thing. And then there is an external Q that can selectively trigger different inputs. So these are equations. So there is one equation of this type for each population. There is one extra equation for the inhibitory pool. And then there are two more equations per population for U and X of the same type as I described to you before. And these are, and so now there are still a set of parameters here that we have to somehow set. The nice thing is that by looking at the synaptic recordings in the slices, you can get an idea about what are the typical range for synaptic parameters. And this is the typical set. This is not, of course, different synapses cannot be described by the same set, but this is, let's say, typical set of parameters that are reasonable for this slice recording. So you have facilitation time constant on the order of a second. You have a depression time constant on the order of 100 milliseconds, and you have this release probability parameter, which is roughly 1/3. So this already constrains the model quite nicely because it reduces the uncertainty. Then you have some other sets of parameters. This is again, this is synaptic time constant that can be well constrained by physics, and this strength parameters can be adapted so that the network works in a certain regime that we are interested in. And then there is a background input that we can change as a user, as a kind of a control parameter that, in my view, it just describes the total attentional state of the brain. So if you pay attention to a certain type of stimuli, you are increasing the input to this network. So let's see how this network works. So this is a situation where you load it with 4 memories. So you provide 4 queues. So 4 memories out of the total number of memories that are stored in this network are activated. And then you see the network enters into regime, this periodic attractor, where these populations continuously and sequentially activate, right? So, and in this case, it happens in the same order, right? So you have red, blue, green, and I guess this is magenta or purple. Okay, so you have red, blue, green, purple, and then again red, blue, green, purple. So this would continue indefinitely if you don't provide any more inputs, right? So here you see there is a successful working memory regime. You provide, let's say, 4 words, and then the network remember all of these 4 words, but there is no persistent activity. These neurons don't fire persistently, and they never fire simultaneously. Okay, so why? Why these reactivations happen? This you can understand by looking at this effective synaptic state for the neurons from each population. So again, in the same color, I plot this product J times U times X. So this determines the effective strength, instantaneous strength of the synapse in each population. So you see before these cues were provided, there was some baseline level of strength. Every time the populations were triggered, there was a brief period of facilitation, then there is a depression, and then there was a recovery from depression. So the synapse became facilitated at a certain time after the trigger. So in this case, you see this happens roughly half a second after the presentation. The synapse became in its most strong state. And at this moment, the population reactivates again. Okay, and again, if you follow the blue population, the same thing happens. And then it reactivates, the synapse depresses again, then it facilitates again, and then at the tip point reactivates again. So every population here behaves in the same way, but it's all shifted by a certain time. Okay, so this is why this sequential reactivation happens. But if you now try to add more memories, you see that this will not work. So you present 5 memories. So you add another color here. But what happens is that only 4 are reactivated. So one of them is lost. So in this case, I think the one that is lost is actually the one that was presented at the 4th position. So you present 5 inputs, 5 triggers, and then only 4 are reactivated later. So the network goes into the same, more or less the same periodic attractor as in the previous case. So it loses 1 memory. So you can imagine if I tell you 5 words, but I tell you them in this kind of a very quick presentation, and then you only remember 4, right? And 5 kind of slips, right? So you you cannot then recall it, right? As if you didn't hear it. Okay, so in this case, and this is really, there is no tuning here. So we just put some parameters which are quite reasonable from recordings. Of course, we had to adapt the synaptic strength so that this regime is implemented, and we have this capacity 4 that that makes sense also from psychological perspective. So why is this? How did this happen? It doesn't really always happen. So of course, it's not always happens. If you will change these parameters, you will get other capacity. So for example, I'll show you now how we can estimate the capacity from these processes that we have in the network. So why there is a capacity? Why couldn't all 5 of these memories be maintained later? So you can somehow get intuition from this picture already, because you see that there is a certain period that passes between every time the network, the population is reactivated, either as a result of external trigger or by itself. There is this depression, so the synapses depress, and then after a certain moment in time, they reach the optimal state, the most strong state, and the next reactivation has to happen around this moment, right? Not exactly at the peak, but around this moment. Why is this? Because if this reactivation misses this point, then there will be a next pattern that will take over, and then the memory will decline. And this is exactly what happens to this purple population, right? The purple population was activated here, but I don't know if you can follow this line, but by the time it was supposed to go up, it was suppressed by the green population. So the green population, it just happened that it was reactivated by the time the purple population was supposed to reactivate. And so the purple population missed its chance. And then this its synaptic strength declined. And then eventually it will never be reactivated again. So the information would completely disappear from the network. So there is a certain period. So this overall period of this periodic attractor cannot be arbitrarily increased. It has to be, it's determined by the time it takes for the synapse to reach its optimal state after being depressed. Okay. So then you can ask, okay, so if this is cannot be arbitrarily can be arbitrarily long, why can't you squeeze more memories into this period? And this is also clear because every time one of the populations reactivates, because there is this reciprocal inhibition, all the other populations are inhibited at this time. So you cannot have a very quick reactivation of the other population because it's temporarily inhibited by the reactivation of the previous one. So there must be a certain time that passes by then that will allow this population to recover from inhibition and reactivate. Okay, so you have this limits just because of the processes that we put into the network, that we cannot have an arbitrary long period of this attractor. So there is a certain Tmax, but there is also not arbitrarily small time between the reactivations that we call here delta. So there is a certain minimal value of delta. And so this means that you cannot put more than a certain number of memories, which is given roughly by the ratio of these two variables. Okay, so this is intuitively why this the network cannot has a certain capacity. And now it's just a more quantitative question is, can we really put some estimates on both of these time variables in order to to get an idea of what capacity this network can have. So I will show you briefly, because this is something that you can do quite precisely if you do some approximations to these equations. I don't think we can really go very deep into this mathematical analysis, but just to give you an idea that what kind of approximations you do. So let's go back to this. Let's keep track of this one of these traces. So let's say we are looking at one particular population. Let's say they're at 1, and this is the this facilitation and depression equations for the synaptic variables for this population that determines this trace. So this determines the that after reactivation the synapses depress, and then they facilitate back and get into this optimal state. So these are nonlinear equations. So the mathematical challenge here is, because you have this products of these variables, U and R, it's very hard to solve these equations analytically. It's basically impossible to solve them analytically. So it's not possible to write the analytical expression for this time course of the synaptic state. However, we can notice that in between these reactivations, this population is practically silent, right? There is very little activity here that you cannot see by eye, but it's practically zero, right? So the neurons only active during the reactivation. So this means that you can actually neglect these nonlinear terms here to put them to 0. And this simplifies this greatly, right? Because now you have just 2 set of linear equations that you can very easily solve. And then you can analytically calculate this time course of synaptic depression and facilitation. And then you can just calculate at what point in time the product of these 2 variables reaches its peak, right? So it's a very simple exercise. I don't want to do it here, but you can believe me that it's very easy, especially if you assume that facilitation time constant is much longer than depression time constant. So this is our assumption about this model. And you can write down this analytical estimate. So the period of this attractor, the period of this solution is proportional to the depression time constant of the synapses, and also logarithmically depends on the ratio of facilitation and depression. So this is a, as I said, in the cortical synapses, this is a has an order of few hundred milliseconds, but you can also have a logarithmic correction depending on how the ratio of facilitation and depression time constant, and there is also some dependence on the release probability. So all of the synaptic parameters are important to determine the period of this. So this is one calculation, and the second calculation is for this interpopulation time distance. So what is the minimal? How close these reactivations can be to each other, right? So let's say you have a red population reactivated. When will the next population, how close to the red it can reactivate? So in order to address this question, we need to look at the activities of these 2 populations. So here I show you the firing rate of purple population and the synaptic synaptic activity of the green population. So in this case, the purple population is reactivated before the green. And you see what happens is that when the purple population reactivates, there are two effects of this reactivation. There is a increase in the inhibition. So the black here stands for the activity of the inhibitory pool. So the inhibitory pool is activated with some delay, synaptic delay, so there is inhibition. And as a result of this, the green population is inhibited by this inhibitory pool, right? There is no direct crosstalk between purple and green populations, but through this inhibition, the purple population effectively inhibits the green population. So the green population is inhibited, and for this network, this is a very strong. You see that the inhibition here is quite strong, and then it has to recover from this inhibition until it goes back to a place, to a certain level from which the recurrent excitation can invoke this intrinsic reactivation, like a population spike here in the green population, right? So it has to reach a certain limit, a certain value, minimal value H min, before it can actually go up. So we need to look at this green population in this period of time, right? From the time it's inhibited by the population spike in the purple population, up to the moment when it can reactivate again. So in this period of time, we need to look at the equation that governs the synaptic variable for this purple population. So we need to write it down. So this is the equation for the corresponding synaptic variable. Again, there is a passive decay, there is the recurrent excitation, there is an inhibition, and there is a background input. And again, this is a very complex equation because you actually have to write another equation for U and X. And so altogether, it's impossible to solve it analytically. So we need another approximation. So how do we make this approximation? We notice that we are now looking at this equation only at this variable, at this time period between these two subsequent reactivations. So this is a very brief time period, much briefer than the overall period of simulation. So if you now look back at this, if you look back at this panel, so you see that at this time scale, so this is, let's say, if you look at the red population just in this moment between the reactivations of these two populations, you see that the synaptic variable is more or less at the steady state, right? Because the synaptic variables are slower than this time between the reactivation. So you can neglect this dynamics in the synaptic processes here and replace the synaptic variable at its maximal state. So this already simplifies this a lot. So instead of looking at the equations for U and X, you just clump this term at a certain variable. So this becomes just a number. And you can also neglect the inhibitory term because the inhibition also is 0 for most of the duration of this interspike interval. So now you have just one isolated equation for the synaptic variable H for the green population. It's still a nonlinear equation because you have this R of H. This is a function that translates input into the output for this population. But you can look at it graphically. If you plot this, so this is some right. If you take a right-hand side of this equation and plot it as a function of H, so there are two branches of this function. So for negative values, you mostly have minus H because for negative values of H, the activity is very low. So you have minus H term. And for positive values of H, R of H is increasing linearly with a slope that is larger than 1. So you have this very fast increase in the slope. And here there is some kind of crossover. So this is how this right-hand side equation looks. There are two straight lines with different slopes going into one another. And the initial position for this equation will be this negative value of the synaptic input, which is the inhibited state of this population. So what happens when this population recovers from inhibition is that the value of this function tells you the flow of h to the right, because this is the derivative of h with respect to time. So you see that this function is above 0. So this means that the population recovers from slowly recovers from inhibition. It reaches this lowest point of the function, and then speeds up and then goes very fast up. So this is what corresponds to this fast reactivation of this thing. So all we need to know is how long it takes for the synaptic variable to synaptic activity to reach this minimal point. So we need just to solve this linear differential equation with this initial condition. So again, this is a simple exercise, and this depends very much on how high this function is above 0, right? Which is determined by the background input. If the background input is not strong enough, then this function actually is not above 0 at a certain point, and then there will not be recovery at all. So the population will recover to this crossing point, and then will never reactivate again. So there is a certain value of the background input that you need in order to elevate this function above 0. And then we can write down the approximate solution for this equation. So the time it takes, that's what we call delta, to reach this minimal point will be proportional to tau, which is the time constant of inhibition, with the logarithmic correction, which depends on how strong the inhibition was immediately after the reactivation of the previous population. So if the inhibition was very strong, it will take longer time to recover, and also depends crucially on the background input. If the background input is below a certain critical value, then this diverges. So there will never be delta goes to infinity. But if we increase the background input above the critical value, then the delta can be made smaller. So the time to reactivate to the next reactivation can be controlled by the background input. So this is all summarized in this one equation. So this is our final estimate for capacity in terms of all the parameters that we have in the network. Right? Some of them are hidden here. So for example, this value of H0 depends on the strength of the inhibitory connections. This is a background input, but all of the parameters of the network that we can kind of roughly estimate from electrophysiological recordings can be now put together, and we have capacity. As I showed you before, for realistic numbers of synaptic parameters, you have a small number. You have a number like 5, 4, 5, 6 that explains this psychological phenomenon of very limited capacity. Okay, so you can say this is a success of this model, that it can it can provide some kind of mechanistic explanation for the psychological phenomenon, which is the working memory capacity. And now I want to, so this we can now go back to integrated file network and confirm this in the network simulations. I don't want to speculate on this. I want to finish just by one, I think, interesting reasoning is why really. So can we still go back to our fundamental question? Is why capacity is so low? So I say, okay, so we have these synaptic properties that are read the question. So there was a question that I want to answer before I continue. Misha, your model is based on short-term plasticity, so you work with given synaptic strengths. What do you think will happen after a number of recalls be enough to say long-term plasticity happened? Will capacity degrade or vice versa increase? Have you considered synaptic normalization? Okay, so I did not consider synaptic normalization, and I also did not consider long-term plasticity. So I'm imagining the situation where these memory items are very well known to the brain. So let's say these are familiar words or familiar images where you actually don't do any more long-term plasticity in the synapse. That's really an interesting idea. So let's say what happens if you have new words. Let's say you are learning a new language. And then that's indeed an interesting question that I didn't consider, whether the capacity will be, well, when you learn the words, whether you can increase the capacity. And I would say introspectively, this would mean that it should be more difficult to remember words in the foreign language, even if you already learned the words. But if you keep learning them better and better, probably you can increase the capacity. I did not consider it, but I think that's an interesting idea to consider. Thank you for the question. Let me just conclude by one particular set of simulations that addresses the question that it's still, we still don't have a fundamental answer to the question of why capacity is so low. Because you can say, why couldn't you just change the synaptic parameters and make capacity longer, right? You can, no, there is no obvious reason why you cannot have synaptic time constants, let's say 10 times longer. And if you have them 10 times longer, you will have 10 times higher capacity or even more. Why does the brain, why didn't the brain do it? I have one particular answer. It's just a proposal, could be many answers. I just want you to show this particular thing. So let's simulate the situation where you are perceiving speech, right? And let's say I'm speaking with short sentences. Every sentence is 4 words. So how would you understand? How would you perceive this speech? So you have, so I tell one sentence, let's say 4 words, and then you have to remember them until you can understand what the sentence means. So you have to have the background input at the level where you can have 4 words simultaneously in the working. So now there is an issue, right? That you cannot just continuously perceive the next sentence without doing something with this words. Because if you just continue perceiving the next words, there will be a mess, right? There will be kind of a mix of words from different sentences and you will not understand anything. So what do you have to do? You have to temporarily reduce the input. You have to terminate these oscillations, but you have to do it for long enough time so that the synaptic processes that are working here should decay enough back to in the direction of the spontaneous state. So this is why I think when we speak, we always make pauses between the sentences, right? It would be very difficult to perceive, to understand what I say if I don't stop anymore, right? It's a very common observation. The people who speak fast without stops, it's very difficult to understand what they say. So what I speculate is going on is that when I make this pause, which is a little bit longer than time within the sentence, you are the brain reduces the input for some time, and then when I start speaking again, you increasing it back to high level, and you now start collecting new words. And this is the example where everything works nice, right? So you have new sentence, you have new words accumulated, and there is no mess. If I would not stop for long enough, so let's say if I speak fast with no pauses, I don't know why I cannot move further. then this situation happens. Let's say for some reason you don't have enough time to clear the working memory from previous words. So you try to do the same thing, but then you see there is a problem, because the moment you increase the background input back to the high level, the last word from the purple word from the previous sentence popped up. Why did this happen? Because the synaptic strength of the neurons, corresponding neurons, didn't decay sufficiently, no? And so this popped up. And now you have a mix. You have this prevents you from all the new words to be put into working memory. Okay, so now you can agree with me that will be a strange situation where by the time you hear the second sentence, you have some one word from the previous sentence, and this is presumably makes it difficult to understand what I talk about. So I hope you get the idea that now you can see that the time it takes for this process to clear the working memory from previous information is determined by the synaptic time constants. So I'm saying that you could, of course, make them longer, much longer, but this would carry a price, because the price would be that I would have to speak much slower, right, in order for you to understand what I'm telling. So you could have a very good working memory capacity, but you could make the processing very slow. Processing of putting things, especially clearing information from the working memory, would require a very long time. And this may also have a behavioral cost, right? Because we would have to speak very slowly, and this would have some certain behavioral cost. So this is one idea, and of course, you can think about some other possibilities of why the brain came to some certain regime where the working memory capacity is quite low. Another idea that I recently came up with is that the working memory is also kind of a filter that protects our long-term memory from being oversaturated, right? Because imagine that you are bombarded by information all the time, and as I said, working memory is kind of filters out most of this and selects the information that will then potentially can be brought into the long-term memory. If the working memory capacity would be long, then more information would continuously be entering into the long-term memory, and then the saturation would happen faster. This is another possibility that we could consider. Okay, I think I just stop here. This is a brief summary that you can read. And if you have more questions, I'll be happy to answer now before we take a break.
Okay, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.